Okay, so if you recall in our last session, we covered the field condition sets and gained a bit more of an understanding of how the field visibility works when utilizing a field condition set, as well as the SLAs and how we can utilize the field condition sets for our service level agreements, allowing us to define certain timeframes and responses with the tickets that we submit. So the last part that we are going to focus on today is purely going to be the triggers and what they entail utilizing what we would call automatic changes and notifications. Now, these triggers are very similar to field condition sets and how they work, but their functionality is slightly different and are utilized, as I said, for our notifications for an item called automatic changes. So again, if we recall, this is our form, just going over some of the features that we looked at in our last session. So we built a couple of functions to hide the visibility of certain items, etc. So when we are submitting a ticket, if we recall, we have our items here, and if we select other, this is going to make this field appear. And likewise, if we select additional upload here, it's going to make that second field appear there. So the next part, as I mentioned, utilizing triggers is going to create the other functionality that we set up in the first session of our form, which is with this department field populating with the appropriate manager when we select, say, marketing, for instance. Again, that's not currently working. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, understanding that functionality, how it can be used within our form. And as I said, that's going to be utilizing what we call triggers. So if I jump forward and go back into our form from the admin side, there we go, help desk. Sorry, I'm a bit slow today. There we go. We can see, of course, that as mentioned, our field condition sets are in place. These are utilizing different responses within our fields to make certain functionality happen and occur. So these are all revolving around specific fields that we've defined, as well as statuses, for instance, which we utilized in our workflows in the second session that we had. Now, our triggers, as I said, are slightly different here, and their functionality can be adjusted in a certain way to make functionality really occur here. And as we can see, there's a couple of items already added on this, but normally our triggers are something that, functionally speaking, when you first come into an InfoCapture form, this will be completely empty. So there's a couple on here just from sort of previous functionality and creation, but to sort of go over some of the understanding here again and define some of these things, we'll explain these in order. So I'm going to delete these just to make it clearer. Okay. Done. Okay. So as mentioned, our triggers, when we first come to this, will usually be empty, and we have the ability to create a trigger up here. In addition to creating a trigger from the actual section, we can also turn a field condition set into a trigger as well. So when we are utilizing a field condition set to want to become an automatic change or have that functionality, the easiest way to do that will be to first off create the condition set. So as an example, if we go back to another tab and look at our form once more, again, we have this department field, and what we'll be really wanting to do is field condition sets to, or defining certain responses in this to make this appropriate manager be selected, etc. And the best way to utilize that, of course, are these field condition sets. Condition set here. Okay, and let's say we'll have, for instance, department equals marketing. Again, same sort of naming convention. If we recall in our last session, we mentioned with our field condition sets, the idea of utilizing one of these three methods. You can select all three, again, if you're unsure, but certainly for this one, I'm not actually planning to utilize any of these. This is purely going to be used as a trigger, so I don't need it to fall into field rights, I don't need it to fall into the workflow, and I don't need it to fall into service level agreements. So I'm actually going to leave all three of these unticked. Now, as I go down, I'm then going to go to the department field, of course, and define this to be my field condition set. Now, before I hit save at the bottom, we can see this item here specifying, do we want to turn this particular item into a trigger? Okay, and if we do, of course, simply all we have to do is select that checkbox, hit save, and not only will this be created as a field condition set, as mentioned, we can see here it is, but it will also have been turned into a trigger. And then, as I said, this can be then used for our dynamic field changes or automatic changes as they're listed on the left-hand side. And for notifications to alert the appropriate department, for instance, or the appropriate manager based on this functionality as well. Okay, and that's pretty much how triggers work. As I said, you can utilize them in the same way. You can simply copy a field condition set, turning it into a trigger, but there is also the opportunity, just like field condition sets, to create your own triggers directly. And with a field condition set, of course, we're aware they are quite precise. The definition is if this field equals something, then a certain functionality can happen. Some kind of logic will work in a certain way. And that, of course, is again the same with triggers, as we can see with this one. It's simply saying that if the department field equals marketing, something is going to happen. But with triggers, because they're tied to notifications, they're tied to other functionality that the condition sets are not, they can be a bit more open-ended and broad. So for instance, if we look at creating a brand new trigger, instead of it showing us a list of all of the fields on our form, we will actually see different functionality that this trigger can be reacting to. So the first one, for instance, we can see is ticket activity, and there are a series of options around this trigger, allowing us to define how this trigger is going to be sent or how it's going to identify the issue or the activity, I suppose. We have if any of the following fields have changed, or if none of the following fields have changed. Again, having a very broad aspect, instead of a condition set defining exactly that it's changed and what it actually says, this can simply be if this field has been updated or changed in any way, we can send a notification, we can do an automatic change. Alternatively, if nothing has been changed in that field, then a notification could be sent in regards to that, for instance. Underneath that, these ones are all revolving around the condition sets. And as I said, and as we saw, when converting over a condition set from from the field condition set section, it's much easier to just tick that checkbox at the bottom, converting it, instead of looking at manually creating these utilizing the condition sets. And the reason for that is just the sort of naming convention around this. It can be quite confusing. I'll explain it in a bit more detail in a second. But for now, I am just going to create my own trigger revolving around a new ticket being submitted. So again, I'm just going to simply call this new ticket submitted. It's going to be impacting the ticket activity, and specifically when a new ticket has been submitted, this trigger will be sent out. It will fire effectively. And very similar, if we recall, like the field condition sets, because these are all checkboxes, I can tick more than one of these items. But remember that when we are including more than one functionality in a rule, like a trigger or a field condition set, the logic is and not or, simply meaning that both of the items have to be met for that trigger to work, for that condition set to work. So if I said something like this, we would need it to say that a ticket has been submitted and the type of issue field has been updated in some way. Otherwise, if it's just the ticket being submitted, if it's just the issue being updated or the type of issue, then the functionality will not work in that regard. Okay. So I didn't mention necessarily at the start, but just to clarify, of course, if there are any questions, please feel free just to put them into the chat. Tim, that's a very good point, actually, and maybe that's what we can do for a fifth one. So if anyone can't see, Tim Nolan has just mentioned here that a webinar creating InfoCapture reports would be very useful. And I completely agree. It's quite a ambiguous function, I suppose is the best way to put it. And there's a lot of things going on within the report side. So certainly, thank you very much for that suggestion, Tim. I think we can include that into a fifth session, definitely. But yes, just to clarify very quickly, if anyone does have any questions while going through this, please feel free just to add them into the chat, and I'll be more than happy to answer them when I see them, I guess. So yes, as I mentioned, this one is going to be quite a simple trigger. It's going to only be based on the ticket activity, and that being when a ticket has been submitted. Okay, you'll see underneath, this section here is going to define how we want this notification to be sent. So InfoCapture is slightly unique to other applications where normally you can configure in the communications side whether it's going to be an in-system message, whether it's going to be email. Now, InfoCapture itself originally was purely just via email. There's no way to configure that in any way, just due to the sort of nature of it and the functionality of how it usually is quite important to receive these updates and everything like that. So it was all sort of configured to be email. However, after certain feedback, etc., we've defined that, as you can see, it can be switched to the in-system message function if you prefer. And that's fine, of course. It's really up to you in terms of how you want to receive these alerts. But just so you can see, the configuration is just at the bottom when you're creating a trigger. If you automatically generate a trigger from a field condition set, like we did for that one, it will default, as you can see to this, like so, to email. So the default creation of that will be email, and you can just adjust it to field in-system message at any point if needed. So as I was saying, just very quickly as well, when it comes to triggers utilizing field condition sets, the functionality at the bottom, all 4 of those sort of check areas define that and allow for that control. And we can see that this one itself is utilizing 2 of them, saying condition set, condition was not, and condition is now. So in terms of the wording, this might look a little bit confusing and, confusing as to why we might be using both of them in regards to this. So I just want to quickly clarify the intention of this, the functionality, and why it's beneficial to have both of these selected. Because, realistically, you could just simply have that. And that does make sense, of course, that you're just saying when the condition set now equals marketing, the condition set now equals department equals marketing, I suppose, then this functionality can work, this trigger can be sent. The trouble with that is triggers are very, as I said, literal. They're very sort of open-ended and broad with what they're sort of defining here. So when you're simply putting that the condition set is now marketing in this case, then what's going to happen is every time you go back into that form to make changes, to interact with it in any way, it's going to keep on looking at this trigger and see, yep, it still equals this trigger still works. And if you tied, say, like a notification or something to this, it means it's constantly going to be sending those notifications every single time you go into that ticket, make a change and come back in. Even though you're not changing this field in any way, it's constantly reading this trigger and it's seeing that that works. And that's simply why we would implement something like this. Because what this logic is saying is before we've made any changes or interacted with this in any way, this field did not equal, the department field did not equal marketing, okay? It wasn't saying marketing in any way, that's fine. However, we've now come into the form, we've made some changes, it now does equal marketing, therefore this trigger will work. A notification can be sent out, automatic changes can work in that regard. And that's why this is so important to specify this. Again, using it from a sort of notification logic, otherwise you're constantly going to receive a notification every time an update is made. This is going to sort of prevent that by it being a more defined and sort of reined in with exactly what you mean by the condition set being this, okay? So there we go. So those are potentially how you can create some triggers, either copying them from field condition sets or creating them manually within the trigger section itself. And then these can, as I said, be utilized for both our dynamic field changes and our notifications. So we're going to look at the automatic changes first, or the dynamic field changes for you. But just very quickly, are there any questions from anyone at all? If you just want to put that into the chat. A little bit off topic, Tony, but I do understand your query there. My colleague Gilly, who's the product owner, is in the call with us, I believe. She might be able to shed some light.
I know. Hi, hello. Yes, hello. Can you hear me all right?
Hello.
Hi. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Oh,
hello,
okay.
Gilly. I can hear you.
Okay, great.
Yes.
It is in our plans for next year as part of the big Clarmantis 9 upgrade, but I can't guarantee on a specific timeline now. But it is in our roadmap.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Right.
So yes. Perfect. Okay. Moving on with the sort of trigger functionality here then, just so you're aware. As mentioned, the first thing we're going to look at with these triggers and how they work is within the automatic changes. So this section here, again, this might have some functionality from previous playing around. Let's go in. No, perfect. Okay. So this section here, as it says here, is simply going to allow us to create rules using our triggers and around certain fields within the form to make certain functionality happen. So unlike the field visibility, which is all about hiding or denying the edit rights to a certain field to particular project roles and functionality like that, the automatic changes are specifically about a field being updated or manipulated in some way based on these triggers. So again, instead of it being the visibility, it's the actual content inside that field. So as you can see, the first thing we are presented with really is this drop down, including the fields on our form. Okay, so any of the fields really, we can choose an automatic change to update and adjust. You're welcome, Nicholas. Thank you. And we can see, of course, so in this case, for instance, as I mentioned, and as the plan is, we want to adjust the manager field. We've disabled this when building the form, so we can't manually adjust this. We're planning that the department section will be containing and adjusting that for us. So then in that case, what we want to do is set rules for the manager field. Okay, so if we go to this and we now say add rule for this field, okay, we can see, of course, that the triggers exist that I have created. And for instance, we have the department equals marketing one now. And with that defined, we will then be able to select from that user picker, because of course, if we recall in the first session, we built this as a user list field. It's defined all of the users on the system, so we can really take our pick. Normally, you would, of course, streamline that to the manager group or the specific users who would be relevant to this position. But in this case, of course, I've just picked everyone so we can see. But let's say, for instance, we'll pick James in this case, and then we can add and change that rule. Okay, and it's really as simple as that. We can see that's now been implemented, and we're basically saying when this trigger has been sort of fulfilled, been met, then this field will be then pre-populated and adjusted to specify James Terry. And again, if we then refresh this very quickly for ourselves, okay, and we should see that when we select marketing, James Terry will now be populated into that field. And this is a very good way of automatically adjusting that functionality, configuring those items. And of course, as we can see, it's not just tied to something like that. You can use this to populate any field within the form that you've created. You can also use automatic changes to have like a semi-automated workflow, for instance. In some circumstances, it could be that you would have a confirmation, maybe like a radio button on your form saying, is this correct? And then it could be like a yes or a no. If you select yes, then the status might automatically then go to confirmed. If you select no, it might go to denied, for instance, something along those lines. And these have a very powerful function within the form to create that sort of feature and functionality. It can just streamline a lot of the content within a form. Now, with our triggers, it's very important that, as you can imagine, we will really have to create one for each of the options in that field or the responses that we're anticipating. Because of course, now with that one created, if I go back into this and if I wanted to try and select IT, for instance, this isn't going to go back to or default back to not selected, for instance. This will still remain on James Terry because there's no defining logic as a counter. It's simply the trigger was that when that field equaled marketing at some point, this is going to be the case, and there's no sort of additional trigger to say when it moves away from marketing it should then say someone else. So that's of course what you would have to create in regards to this as well. So of course we've done our department equals marketing one, but let's say we go back to our field condition sets. What's on one of the others? We've got customer support next. Okay, so let's say create a new condition set. Customer support. And again, I don't need to utilize any of these. I can select them if I'm unsure, but in this circumstance, it's not necessary. I'm going to go to department. select customer support. And again, I just want to tick this option to turn this into a trigger. I'm then going to hit save. And like we've done with the other item there, if I just go, we can see, of course, that's been created. And now if I just go back to my automatic changes, sorry, my system's running a bit slow today, as we can see. Okay, if I go back to this, I can simply just go to this add rule section, and this is going to allow me to then utilize another trigger. In this case, we're going to say the customer support, and then let's say this will be Alison, for instance. I'd change that rule. Okay, perfect. And now, of course, if I just refresh this once more, okay, we now select marketing again. It's going to say James Terry. If we select customer support, it's going to say Alison Kelly, for instance, okay? And that's pretty much how our automatic changes work. Again, this can be utilized for other fields in your form. The functionality will be pretty much exactly the same. You can see I can do it even for text fields, for instance. So I could say with the description of issue field, let's say once more, we're going to use one of these triggers that I've created. To load. There we go. You can see this is, of course, one of those text fields that I've got. So let's say it's the department equals marketing one again. There we go. Okay. And if I just change that rule, you can see, of course, this is defining a separate function. This is a different field that's being used. And of course, I can add additional rules to that one as well if necessary. But once more, if we now hit refresh, go back to selecting marketing, we can see that this text field has now been adjusted with this as well. Exactly. So Tim has mentioned there that it is very important that whenever you're utilizing any of these functions, be it a field condition set or a trigger, when you anticipate and want something directly into the form to make a change, like we can see with these, exactly like we can see with the other option here, you might be noticing that the form is quickly loading. And that's all if we remember back from our first session, when we were editing the form or creating the form, the department field, for instance, the type of issue field, these are all reloading the form and changing, okay? And this is important in order to make that functionality work. Otherwise, the form can't refresh, it can't sort of update that functionality that we've applied, and it will simply mean that even though we've built all those rules and created all that functionality, it won't work. It will change once you've actually submitted the ticket, because that will be like the reload. But ideally, of course, you want that information to be changed much sooner than that. So always remember that if a field is going to make something happen, remember it's always the one that's going to be the catalyst, if you will, the item that will be making the change, not the field that is changing. Always make sure that that field will be reloading on changing. So again, department, we've got that working. Type of issue, we've got that working. And again, at the very bottom, we've got this additional upload also reloading on changing, because all of those have a specific rule tied to them, and they're going to make that functionality work. Okay, perfect. So yes, so that's pretty much the automatic changes. There isn't really any other sort of functionality around them. As I said, you can utilize that for much different fields. You can use it to automate some of the workflow. You can even use them to automatically assign the form to certain people if you're using the assign to function. But it can be very useful in those regards. So the next thing using these triggers that I want to look at is going to be the notifications. But before I do, I just want to quickly check, are there any other questions? Does that all make sense? Would anyone like anything clarified there? Okay, looks good. I'll keep an eye out just in case something comes in now. But for now, let's just focus on the notification side of things. So yes, so as I mentioned, our triggers work for both these automatic changes, allowing for this functionality, but they are also important and integral for tying our functionality towards the notification side of things. Most importantly, we can see there's two sections. The default notification fields is not really something to concern ourselves with too much. It's just defining when we're using the default template, which we'll explain in a second, you can choose what information you want to be pulled through. But realistically, when you're building a robust notification function, ideally what you'll be wanting to use are your own templates and creating all of the functionality directly in the notification section. Okay, so Lauren has mentioned an item here. So you're saying I need to activate a text field based on a status change. Would I utilize an automatic change? So just to clarify, that's when it goes into a certain status of your workflow. Let's say awaiting approval, or more info required, or something like that. A new text box is intended to appear, and at that point, whoever is responsible for the form at that point will be then writing into that text field and making sort of informing or adding new information themselves. Is that correct? They will manually be inputting that text. Perfect. Okay. So yes, good question. That wouldn't necessarily be something you'd want to use an automatic change for, because the automatic change is there to make the field filled with a text, if that makes sense. So if the intention was that text box will have some pre-populated text in based on the status, then yes, an automatic change would be good. But what you would, by the sounds of it, it's much better for you to utilize what's called the field visibility. Okay, and this would simply allow you to specify that field and put it into its own group here, if you will. We covered this briefly in the last session, if you, well, in a bit of depth actually in the last session. So if you weren't there, it's on knowledge base for you to go through. That's absolutely fine. But basically you define that and you would simply say that that field would be hidden. No one could see that effectively until it got to that certain status. And at that point, people can interact with it and view it, for instance. So it would be more tied to the field visibility than the automatic changes there. You're welcome. Perfect. Okay, so jumping back to the notifications there. As I mentioned, this section is where you can utilize our triggers once more to build up a series of announcements or alerts, I guess, well, or, notifications to the appropriate individuals, the appropriate departments, or the appropriate project roles, and inform them that a certain action has occurred. Now you can see up at the very top, we can utilize the sort of default notifications to simply just notify the ticket submitter and the ticket handler, so the person who is currently assigned the ticket, that every time a change has been made, whatever that change may be, they will just receive a notification about it. It's going to be fairly impersonal. It's not going to be very efficient in terms of everything, and it can potentially just flood people's inboxes. It certainly can be used in some circumstances, but what would usually be better is, as we can see further down, is this option to configure our advanced notifications. And these are going to allow us to customize using the triggers and define exactly who they need to be sent to at the appropriate times using our own templates, which we can hand write. So before I even look at creating a new rule, before I start creating a trigger there, or a notification function, I'm actually going to go down to this section first and build a couple of templates. And this just means that I can exactly, I can write exactly what I want and define what my email or my in-system message will say. So let's go to add a new template first. And I'm going to create one here, and let's call this new ticket submitted submitter. Okay, so the reason I'm putting this in brackets is just for me to remember that this one is tied to the person who submitted the ticket. You might have also seen there's one there called support team as an example, as I've done this a couple of times before. But it's bear in mind that where it says name here, this information will not be included on the email or the notification in any way. This is purely for you to see in that template list what this one is simply called. And it's purely however you want to word it, you can call it whatever you want. It's just so you can look at that and easily identify what this template is referring to, or the intention of where it should be going, for instance, which is why I've put the submitter in brackets, because as we'll see in a second, I'm going to be creating two notifications going out on the same trigger, but just to different people, one being the submitter and the other one being the support team. So with that done, you can see I've just named that. We then have our type. This can be changed if you want to spruce up your notification. As you can see, there's either the plain text option or HTML. And if I select HTML, that will open this up into CK Editor and allow us to put some more fancy stuff, changing the fonts and styles, etc., repositioning and putting bullet points if you so desire. It's not mandatory, of course, but if you're wanting to make something very, very fancy or fancier at least, you certainly can use that option there. Okay, now below there we have our subject and our body. And of course, these parts are certainly definitively included into our notifications. So the subject, of course, is going to be our email heading. And then the body is, of course, the email itself or the in-system message if you're using that method instead. So here we can see, of course, thank you for your submission, let's say. And if we go to the body, we will just say, now, that's obviously quite bare bones. You could just have something like that. That's absolutely fine if that's your preference. But you may notice on the right-hand side, there's a series of what are called expressions. And these are going to allow you to pull information through from the form about potentially the user or about data in the form specifically, meaning that you can make it a bit more personal, a bit more defined to what the submission or request is all about. So for instance, instead of typing something like just hello, we can, if we go back to this and put over here, we can see on the right-hand side, there's an expression called submitter. And if I select that, that's going to bring up this little bit of code. Let's put a comma at the end of that. And what this will simply do is instead of it just saying hello, it will say hello. It will look at the ticket that's been submitted in question, identify who has submitted that ticket based on, of course, the data in their profile, and it will pull through that person's name. Okay, and again, just giving it that more personal touch, I suppose. Underneath that, you can see there are, of course, a couple of other expressions. So we can say something like this. Okay. And then there's something like the URL of view ticket page, meaning that when we click that, it's going to take us to view the ticket itself. And there's, of course, a couple more like this. Our common expressions, as they're called. We have stuff revolving around the issue ID, the number of that, who's currently got this assigned, the current handler, the status it's in, the date it was created and last updated. So those are what we would consider our common expressions. Slightly below that, you can see this part here, which says, please select a field. And again, this is going to pull through information from this form specifically. So of course, in this form, I created a name field, an email, department, etc., like that. And that means whichever one of these I select, it will look at the form and it will say, okay, they've put some information in there. This is what they want to represent in the notification here. So you can pick those. And then further below that, we also have our other expressions. And this is very similar. It's just some less frequently used than the common expressions available to you here. Stuff like viewing the notes. So if we recall from previous sessions, as long as you have the appropriate permissions, you'll see on any existing tickets, there's a note section here where you can add your own sort of communication and dialogue. So let's say if a note's been added, you can use the issue notes section to see what note that is, what has been currently said, etc., and certain things like that. Another one which I find very useful is the URL of update issue. So this one that we've currently put, this URL is going to take us to the view perspective. Okay, so it will when we click that URL, we will see this. Okay, so we can view the form, we can view the information on there. The other option that we mentioned here, the URL of update issue, that's actually going to take us, and of course, only if we have the appropriate permissions, but it's actually going to take us to this view. It's going to take us to the edit version, which means that when you click that edit, you will be able to make those changes to the form directly. Instead of having to view the form, press that edit button yourself, and then come here, it can automatically do that. So Tony, customize the body with a CSS code. potentially using the, actually, hold on a second. One of my colleagues might be able to answer that quicker than me. So if you haven't seen, can you customize the body with a CSS code? There is a section, so already cancel, in our system side here. Is it in configuration? Actually, it's localization, I think. I know you can.
Maybe can be clarified what body? Is it just the form itself, or is actually
within the notification, I believe. So just to clarify, Tony.
Oh, there is a type. You have a plain text, but there is an HTML.
Yeah, so the HTML, of course, you could implement, I guess, like HTML in there to change it there. I don't necessarily think there would be a way, or actually, would that just work with CSS as well there? Sorry.
You can insert the CSS file, but be mindful about adding CSS file on the email, because the support for CSS on the email is not as good as browser.
Okay.
So just be mindful, but there's nothing stopping you to add style, inline style into that source mode.
Yeah, and also from this edit view, you can just customize things like bold and color and font and stuff like that, which are usually enough for customizing an email template.
Okay, perfect. So yes, great. But certainly, whatever you want to sort of specify there. And as I mentioned, of course, let's put that back. As I mentioned, so that update option can be very useful in some circumstances as well, where it will just take you directly to this stage. So if you needed to sort of like check something or sign something to approve it, it just removes one step. So that can always be useful as well, the URL of updates. But it really depends, of course, on the type of notification you're trying to send. But let's say, you know, the amount of times I've done this, you probably thought I'd be better at writing these notification templates, but here you go. That can be the one that's going out to the submitter, for instance. Okay. Now, if we go again and add another template, so as you can see, here's the name. Again, that won't be shown on the notification. It's purely for the form builders sort of perspective, etc. So let's create another one, new ticket submitted support team. Okay. And again, I'm just specifying that. So when we're looking at those names, we can differentiate between the two. Okay, let's say this. So we can say new ticket has been submitted. And just so you can see, the subject can also support expressions. So they're not just tied to the body. I can put something like this, and that's, of course, going to put the ID number of the ticket in that email heading. Let's say, something like that. And then another just URL to the ticket, for instance, and then let's save that one. Okay, so those could be a couple of the templates that you can create. And of course, they might all be for other things as well. These ones are both going to be using the same trigger. So they're both going to be tied to a new ticket being submitted, but functionally they could be something entirely different. It really depends on what notifications you need to create and what they need to say, I suppose. But with those created, those templates there, we can see that we can now go up to this advanced part and we can add a couple of rules. It's worth mentioning you can do this straight away. You don't have to create these templates. But as we can see, it just allows you to define the exact information. Otherwise, you'll be using what's considered, as I said, the default template, and you can define what information will be put on that default template, but it's all just very sort of formulaic, very sort of block, and potentially not very well written to try and define certain things that have gone on within the form. So this one will, creating your own templates will just be a bit more beneficial overall. But as we can see, when I go to add new rule, this is going to allow us to define, again, one of the triggers that we've created. So we could even define them around stuff like, you know, if this is specifically to the marketing team, for instance, we could do something like that. Let's have a look at that in a second. But realistically, for now, we're just going to use the new ticket submitted. Underneath that, you then get to pick the template you wish to use. Just so you know, it can be a little bit misleading, I suppose, but when you see this button, this isn't saying, like, this isn't submitting what we've suggested here. This is just simply putting that if we look at this and go, oh yeah, I forgot to create the trigger I needed for this, I can select add new trigger, and that's going to actually open up a new tab or a new window that's going to take us back to the triggers section, as you can see, and it's going to allow me to build a new trigger from scratch. It's just really there as a a reminder, or just a quick link, I suppose, back to creating a trigger if you forgot to add it or create it straight away. All I need to do in this case, though, is just say new trigger submitted, ignore this part, and then I get to choose my template. So out of the ones I've created, again, you can see the brackets just help define exactly which one I need. So I'm going to say the new ticket submitted and the one intended to go to the submitter. Select that. And then, of course, we have the project role. So if we recall from our second session, no, in fact, was it? Yes, second, might have been the first, can't remember. But we looked at creating our project permissions. And within those permissions, we need to define a series of what are called project roles. And these are just, people with certain responsibilities and functions within the form directly. And we can see here, of course, that the ones I created, we have an all users, a support desk, and an admin. And if you recall, hard-coded into every single item, or every single form that we create, there is always going to be a submitter and a ticket handler project role as well. In this case, because of course we don't want to send it to all users, as everyone will receive that notification. It doesn't want to go to the support desk, doesn't want to go to admin. We want to send this directly to the submitter. So the person who's filled out this form, when they hit submit, they become that submitter. And then of course this notification will be sent to them, thanking them, I guess, for their request or submission here, as that's what the template's saying. Underneath, you can see there are a couple of other options. These are probably a bit more niche, but certainly do have their uses. You can see on top of the standard project roles that we've created, there's also the option here to send it to a specific email address. And this can be done with multiple email addresses. You just need to separate them with a comma. But simply put, you can just type in, you can hard type a particular email address, and that means that the notification will also go to that. You can just simply put it that you don't want it to go to any of these project roles and simply type in an email here, and it will be sent to that address, which can be very useful for sort of like group inboxes for certain departments and things like that. As I mentioned as an example, if you wanted to inform like the marketing team that a ticket had been submitted from someone on their department, just as an example, we could use that trigger, and then we could type in like the marketing inbox or something like that. Alternatively, if we don't want to just type in an email address, there's also this option here, which is and the form field. Okay, now the wording might be slightly strange, but what this is simply saying is if we've implemented a user picker field in our form, or if we've put a text field with the string format being email, we can basically pick from those fields on the form and notify whoever has been populated or whatever email address has been specified in there. Okay, so I could say, again, as an example, if we want to notify the manager of the marketing team, because we've already got that automatic change in place to say to populate that manager field with the manager of the marketing team when that department has been selected, we can then utilize that functionality, which is working in the automatic change, to then also send a notification to that manager field, whoever has been specified in that manager field, when the ticket has been submitted. Okay, and it just simply alerts them and informs them that this ticket has been submitted by one of their staff members, for instance. Ideally, you'd probably want to create a whole new template for that, because this wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. But that sort of functionality is also available. But again, in this case, we want this to be based on a new ticket being submitted, it going to the submitter of ticket, using this template. I'm just going to go to now say add change rule. Okay, and there we go. So there is our trigger. We can see it's now been created to set up a notification. So the notification type is, of course, an email that's being sent out. The template is going to be this one, and where it's being sent to is the submitter of tickets. Again, this trigger can be used multiple times to send out different notifications to different people. So I can now go add new rule once more, use the same trigger. This one is going to use the support team one, and then I'm going to use this project role for this case, and then once more just hit add change rule. Okay, and simply put, that's now going to send that notification. It's going to read that trigger. It's going to send that out to the submitter with this template, and then it's going to send it out to the support desk with this template. Oh, good question there, Tim. Yes, so for anyone who hasn't seen, Tim's just said, if I have two fields with the string as email, will there be two and the form field options, or will I have to create another rule? So correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, but just to clarify, would this show another version of this if there was more than one of these to pick from? Is that correct? If you're using the email field, at least. Perfect. So just to clarify, it would not, and as you can see, it only allows you to select one of those options. So in your scenario, yes, you would have to create another rule to send that to the other group of people there as well. So if there was two email addresses, and even if it was the same template and everything, you'd need to make sure it's using the same trigger to find the same template. First one would be, email manager 1, and then the second one would be email manager 2. But yeah, so you would have to create them as separate rules there. Perfect. Okay. Now, another thing to be aware of here, so this is going to be quite a rarity, but it can happen in certain circumstances. Now, of course, these triggers can sometimes conflict with one another. And what I mean by conflict is that the system will see that based on what those triggers might have been, because they could be just very broad. And so the system will see that based on something you've changed in the form, 2 notifications should be sent to you. Let's say that we had a new ticket submitted and let's say, in fact, we had something like this where we had another trigger. Let's say using this one, and it's using the same template. This part wouldn't matter, but the most important part is, of course, this. So realistically, we can see that these two, this department equals marketing, would go to the submitter, and so with this new ticket submitted, even though they're using separate triggers, they would pretty much be sent at the same time based on the functionality of how the form works and how those triggers work. Now we can see that that's what I mean by conflict, the idea that both of these would be sent at the same time. But the system will look at that and go, you probably don't need both of these to be flooded at you at the same time because they're revolving around similar information, basically. So if anything like this occurs, is bear in mind that it will take the top out of the triggers. So if there is a conflict for 2 notifications being sent to you at the same time, it will always take the top one of those. And that's why you can see there's these arrows on the left-hand side. So if you want to make sure that a specific email out of those 2, if a conflict occurs, is sent out, you just need to make sure that the more important one, I guess, is at the top of this list, which of course you can see you can do by repositioning with these arrows here. But as I said, that's probably going to be quite a rarity. There won't be many situations where you'll have too much of a conflict with notifications. But just so you're aware, that is also another functionality that needs to be sort of taken into account when it comes to these notifications. But yeah, that is pretty much everything when it comes to our triggers and then the notifications tied to those. Are there any questions quickly about that at all? That's a very good question. So Tim has just asked a question there that if I have a user who is the support desk and is also sent to an email address, will they get 2 notifications? In that situation, they will, Tim, purely based on the fact that the system can't identify, like if they were part of 2 project roles, they would only get the one. But because this is independent, if you will, this isn't tied to the same sort of logic that these are, then yes, it would send out two effectively. I don't believe it does. No, in fact, it doesn't for the and the form field. It's only for the email address, because that's something that you're manually inputting and it can't reference that with the system at all. Perfect. Fantastic. Yeah, because the email, basically, it'll just see if that's an email. Yes, happy with that, and submit it. Okay, perfect. Are there any other questions at this time? Okay, looks good. Right. So that's pretty much everything, as I said, in terms of the actual form building, the functionality, and the advanced rules behind that to make certain, of course, fields disappear and reappear based on our functionality, to make fields populate, sending our notifications, and if we recall on our previous sessions, of course, moving the workflow along to the appropriate statuses based on where we are, again, using our field conditions. Now, we only have a few more minutes left for this session. So there's a couple of things, just additional sort of tweaks that you can do to InfoCapture just to make things look a little bit more presentable in some cases. And this is purely from a front-end view. So if I go back to the ticket list as an example here, you can see that my ticket list options here are showing the ID number, it's showing the SLA color, which is something we discussed in our last session, how many comments have been added to this particular ticket, and how many files have been attached. And that's fine, of course, that can be useful information to see. But if we reference that or contrast that to something like our support tickets form here, we can see from this ticket list view, this is a lot cleaner in terms of what information we can immediately gather from looking at this list. The actual functionality here is exactly the same. We are on technically the same page, just for a different form. And of course, already we can see so much more information. We know a lot more about this ticket before even having to click on it to interact with it or to read the information there. So that's something that I just quickly wanted to clarify while we still have a couple of minutes left in this session. So if we go back to the admin side for our help desk form, on the left-hand side, there's a couple of other options. So we've covered pretty much everything up at these top parts, but underneath there's another section here called list options. Now, some of these aren't necessarily all that important. The ticket list options allows us to say how many tickets we want per page and stuff like that, for instance. But what I really want to focus on today is this ticket list columns. And as it says here, choose which columns you want to appear from that ticket list view. Okay, so from this perspective, which columns from our particular form do we want to now show? And of course, we can see the ID, comments, and files, just like we can see here, are already there. They're hard-coded in and they are fixed. So we couldn't remove them either if we wanted to, though I wouldn't recommend doing so anyways. But that does mean that we can also come to this section, and this is going to again show us all of the fields of this specific form and update this appropriately. So we could say that we might want the department field to appear, and we just have to select that and then press add. Okay, let's put maybe the type of issue. Let's say who's submitted this, maybe what status it's in, and potentially who it's currently assigned to. Even in fact, actually, let's put date created in there as well and go add. Okay, so those potentially are a couple of things. And if you want to reposition them, you can see you can simply just drag and drop them to wherever you need them to go. But what that simply means is with these items added here, if I come back to this and I hit refresh, you'll see that this is going to show us again, not necessarily the exact same information because the form of course is different, but this is going to show us a lot more again information this time, giving us a bit more of an overview and an understanding of certain items before we even look at the form directly. And again, it just helps with that. It clears up a couple of things and just makes the forms overall easier to read and understand. Another little tweak I just wanted to show as well before we end today's drop-in session is would call the custom messages. So of course, on the list options as well, just to quickly mention the other things, the searchable fields can be quite useful as well. So this is the standard list view, but we can see up here, there's this button to take us to a different view. It's the same information basically, but there is also now the ability to use a keyword search or expand this to an advanced search, where we can say that we want to filter this by particular statuses, who it's been assigned to, things like that. But at the moment, again, we can see there's quite a limited amount of options to filter this between. So from the admin side once more, and as I said, through this searchable fields option, you can then, very similar to like the ticket list columns, we can just say that we would also add some other fields. We'd say the department one would be on there. Okay. Maybe the manager. This, of course, is only going to allow us to, in fact, type of issue will be better. This won't show us the full list of fields on the form. It will only show fields that had like a select value. Okay, so ones, you know, like department, manager, things like that. Anything that could we've automatically put the value, which would be like a drop down or radio buttons. Anything that's a free text field couldn't be implemented to this because, of course, that's too broad. This needs to have the definitive values. But with those specified, if I hit refresh once more on this and go back to this advanced search, you can see, of course, now department has been concluded and so has type of issue as well. If I really wanted to, there's also this filter to change it into a 3-column layout. And if I do that, well, basically, while it's waiting to load, it will just separate it into 3 columns instead of the 2 for searching there, just potentially tidying it up a bit more. If you have, as you can see, more, you know, a large amount of options to search from, just makes it the use of the screen a bit better. Okay, so those are a couple of options in the list option section. And as I said, a final thing that I just want to quickly cover is this custom messages section. So when we're looking at our form like so, we can see, of course, up at the top, if I mouse over some of these things, like this says list of tickets, this says submit tickets. And in this type of form, because it's a help desk form, that makes perfect sense. You know, this is a ticket, you know, you're submitting something along those lines. That's an absolutely fine thing to say. However, as we've mentioned previously, InfoCapture can be quite broad. You can create forms for all sorts of things, for HR, for anything like that, where it might not necessarily make sense to call it a ticket or word it in that way, which is why we have this custom messages section. And again, this is going to be for this particular form. It won't be for my support desk. It won't be for my t-shirt order request. It's purely for the help desk one here. But we can see, for instance, instead of this being something like submit ticket, I could say submit IT issue. If I change that and then hit save, okay, we can see that that is going to be what we want that text to now say. So if I come back to this and once more, if I just hit refresh, we can see that that text has now been adjusted and appropriately for that. Lorna, okay, so a quick question. Will you make this recording available this week? So I would probably say not, because of course we're on Thursday now, but early next week, so Monday or Tuesday, this should be live for you to review. But it probably won't be ready by Friday, just to clarify for you there. No worries. Okay. But yes, as you can see, and there are, of course, a couple of other items there where it says update issue, clone issue, stuff like that. You can change the language, of course, because something might not be an issue. It might be something entirely different. So you can change that appropriately to what's more reflective and relevant to the type of form you've built. But yes, as we can see, that's pretty much come to the end of the session. I just quickly wanted to go over those last couple of things. But yes, again, thank you so much for your time, everyone. I hope this has proved useful with the sort of final parts of this form. As has been suggested, and I think that's a very good idea by Tim, he's requested the idea that we could do an InfoCapture webinar on reports, which I think is fantastic and something I will look at to creating a 5th session for that in the future. So look forward to that next month, I guess. But yes, again, thank you very much for your time, everyone. Take care and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you, As.
That's okay.